She felt it through the sole of her boot before she saw it. A faint rhythmic pressure moving through the bottom rail of the cull pen, steady and low, the kind of vibration that has a living source. Ruth Yoder had been cutting through the back lot of the Kidron Auction to reach her buggy, feed bill folded in her coat pocket, mind already on the drive home, and she had stopped without deciding to stop, her boot resting against the lower rail of a pen she had not intended to look at. She looked up. You should know that Ruth Yoder was not the kind of person who stopped for things. She had a buggy to load and a schedule and a feed bill already drawn up in her head. She had 11 does at home, who needed the evening milking and a barn that needed fresh bedding, and 2 children who would eat supper, whether she was there to put it on the table or not, which meant her mother-in-law would put it there if she was late, which she did not like to rely on more than necessary. This is relevant. When Ruth Yoder stopped for something, it was because the something had already entered her before she had time to decide about it. The dough was in the far corner of the pen, a big framed boar cross with a flat coat the color of old straw, and she was pressing her forehead against the rail in a slow, repeating arc, not scratching, not restless. The pressure was steady and returned to the same point each time, the way a doe in hard labor will brace against whatever is available when she has nowhere else to put the weight of what is happening to her. Her sides were drawn up and released, drawn up and released. Ruth could see the outline of what was coming. The pen held 23 animals. Ruth counted them before she counted anything else, because she always counted before she concluded anything. The pen tag on the gate said they had come out of a large-scale operation near Coshocton that was selling down its breeding stock. Too many animals for the land base they were keeping, a commercial boar cross and dairy mix operation that had run the numbers and cut. The consignment price on the tag was $4.10 per head for the lot. Take all. The lot had been sitting in the pen since morning. Nobody had bid. Ruth looked at each animal in sequence. Thin, most of them, but not starved. The kind of thin that comes from a hard winter and inconsistent hay, not from neglect that went all the way down to the bone. Several were moving unevenly, the slow, careful walk that means foot pain, the early or middle stages of foot rot rather than the end stages, which was a different thing. 2 were clearly in late pregnancy. The one pressing her forehead against the rail was further along than the other. Ruth found the auction clerk inside the livestock barn and paid $30,000 cash, which was $4.10 for each of 23 does, and asked to borrow a stock trailer for 2 hours, which she would pay for, and got it and loaded the goats and was on the road home by 3 in the afternoon. She had owned goats since she was 19 years old. She had learned them first on her father's farm, then on her husband's, and for the last 3 years on her own, which was her husband's farm, still in every practical sense, but no longer in the sense that anyone else was making decisions on it with her. Eli had died in February 3 years ago, a ruptured appendix, quick once it ruptured, preceded by 2 days in which everyone around him believed what he said when he said it was just a bad stomach. Ruth had not believed it after the first night, but she had not known what to do with that belief except to keep watching him carefully, to keep checking what there was to check, to keep doing the next available thing. She had driven him to the hospital herself in a borrowed car, and that was the last time he had been in this county. She had a debt on the goat barn and 2 children and an 11 doe milking herd, and a soap-making operation that sold through the Kidron Auction and to 3 Englisher buyers who came to the farm directly. She did not think of herself as managing, which implied it was difficult. She thought of herself as working, which it was. The farm sat on a county road south of Charm, 63 acres with a creek along the south boundary and a pasture on the northeast corner that backed up against a limestone ridge. Eli had mentioned once during a wet spring 5 years ago that he had seen a dark patch of ground in the northeast corner, the kind of sustained wet that comes from below rather than from above. He had meant to look into it and had not. Ruth had filed the observation in the place where she filed things that had not yet been useful, and it had stayed there. She was thinking about the northeast pasture on the drive home, not about the spring specifically, but about whether she could rotate the new goats through that corner if the ground wasn't too soft. She was also thinking about the laboring doe and how much time was left, and about the footbath she would need to draw, and about whether she had enough zinc sulfate concentrate in the barn to treat 16 animals, which was her preliminary count of the ones showing the uneven walk. She had done the arithmetic on the pregnancy before she left the auction. 17 of the 23 were showing the signs she knew. The filled-out udders, the ligaments softening she could feel by hand when she pressed at the tailhead of each doe while loading them, the wide-set rear legs and the sunken appearance just ahead of the hip bones. 2 were too young to be bred, probably 8 or 9 months. Nice framed doelings that had been thrown in with the adults because it was a take-all lot. 4 more she was less certain about. She would know more after a night of observation. 17 confirmed pregnant from 23, does at $94.30 for the lot. That was where she started. She unloaded them in the dark by the light of a kerosene lantern hung on the barn hook and sorted them into 2 pens. The laboring doe went into the kidding stall, which was 6 feet by 8 feet and bedded deep with straw. The other obvious pregnancy, a smaller animal, a dairy cross with long ears and a patchy coat, went into the stall next to her. The remaining 21 went into the main pen, which Ruth had cleared and rebedded that afternoon while the borrowed trailer was warming up, because she had known when she paid the clerk that she would be bringing them home. She lit the propane heat lamp over the kidding stall and adjusted it to hang at the height she used for weak kids, not too close, not so far that the warmth diffused before it arrived. Then she mixed the zinc sulfate footbath in the shallow rubber trough by the barn door. 1 pound of zinc sulfate concentrate to 4 gallons of water, which was the standard ratio for a treatment bath, and she ran each of the 21 pen animals through it by hand, one at a time, holding each foot in the solution for the full 30 seconds before letting them move on. It took an hour and 20 minutes. She would do it again in 4 days, and again after that, and she would keep doing it until the walk changed. The laboring doe delivered at 10:40 at night. Twins, both presented correctly, both born within 12 minutes of each other. The first kid was a small doeling, white with brown ears, who stood in 9 minutes and found the teat in 11, which was normal. The second was a buckling, bigger than his sister, who did not stand in 9 minutes or in 19. Ruth sat with him in the straw, her hand under his sternum, feeling for the strength of his breathing. It was there. She stripped colostrum from the doe into a clean bottle, put a lamb nipple on it, held the buckling's head up with one hand, and let him figure out the pressure. He took 3 pulls and stopped. She waited. He took 2 more. She set him down against the doe's flank, close enough for warmth, and watched to see if he would try to stand. He was on his feet by midnight, unsteady, but on his feet. She checked the other 21 animals at midnight, at 2 in the morning, and at 4. She found no other labor that night. She slept on the cot she kept in the barn tack room from March to May, under a wool blanket for 2 hours before the morning milking. The next 10 days were the beginning of the kidding window, which ran 3 weeks total, which is standard for a group of does bred together in a 60-day window. Ruth knew she was not going to be sleeping normally for those 3 weeks. She did not think of this as a hardship. She thought of it as the schedule the biology imposed, and she arranged herself around it. The second delivery came on the 3rd day, a single from one of the older does, a healthy buckling, born without assistance. The 3rd and 4th deliveries came on the same night. the 6th day, both from does who had been among the thinner animals, and both sets were twins, and all 4 kids were small but alive in the morning. Ruth weighed each one on the kitchen scale she brought to the barn and wrote the weights on the feed room wall in pencil. 4.1 lbs, 3.9 lbs, 4.4 lbs, 4.2 lbs, under the point of birth weight for a boar cross twin, which was typically 5 to 7 pounds, but not by enough to worry her yet. She would weigh them again in 72 hours and look for a gain of at least half a pound. Sadie Troyer came by on the 8th day with a loaf of bread and a container of soup, which was the standard delivery for a neighbor who was known to be busy. And she stood in the barn doorway while Ruth checked udders on the new mothers. Sadie said she had heard at the auction that Ruth had bought the whole cull lot from the Coshocton operation. Ruth said that was right. Sadie said she had heard they were in bad shape, most of them, that Levi Mast had looked at that same pen and passed on it, which Sadie seemed to think was a meaningful data point. Ruth said Levi had bought 12 animals from the same consignment at a different sale in Millersburg and paid $6 a head for them. She said this without particular emphasis. She said the ones she had bought had foot rot in about 16 of them, but that none of them were too far gone, and that she had 17 confirmed pregnant, and that the kidding had started. Sadie asked how many had been born so far. Ruth said 8 kids from 4 deliveries, all alive this morning. Sadie looked at the barn with an expression that was not quite belief and not quite its opposite. She said she hoped it went well. She left the bread on the bench by the door and went home. That same afternoon, Ruth saw Levi Mast's buggy stop at the end of her lane. He did not turn in. He sat at the end of the lane for a moment, and then his horse moved on, and Ruth went back to what she was doing, which was mixing electrolyte solution for 2 of the thinner does that had seemed slow to rehydrate after the stress of transport. The kidding continued. On the 10th day, a doe delivered triplets, which was not unexpected for boar cross animals in decent condition, and all 3 were alive, but the smallest of the 3, a doeling, was 2.8 pounds, which was below what Ruth wanted to see. She brought the doeling inside into the mudroom off the kitchen and put her in a cardboard box with a towel and a heat pack wrapped in flannel. And she tube-fed her colostrum from a stored frozen supply every 2 hours for the first 12 hours, a small syringe at a time, no more than 30 milliliters at a pass, because the stomach of a kid that size could not manage more without risk. The doeling was alive at hour 12. At hour 18, she was still alive, but had not gained the muscle tone Ruth was looking for. Ruth tube-fed her again, checked her temperature, which was 101.8, which was within the normal range of 101.5 to 104 degrees, and noted it on the wall. She was not finished yet. That was the thing Ruth held when she was sitting with an animal that was doing what this dueling was doing. Present but not fully arriving. The conclusion was not available until you had done everything available to do. The dueling had not finished yet either. Ruth had learned not to separate those 2 things. By hour 24, the dueling was nursing from a bottle. By hour 36, she was standing on her own. She was 3 pounds and 2 ounces on the kitchen scale, and she was standing. Ruth wrote that number on the feed room wall with the others. By the end of the 3rd week, 31 kids had been born from 17 does. One of the does, the oldest animal in the group, a doe whose teeth showed she was somewhere past 6 years old, delivered a stillborn single and did not recover from the kidding. Ruth found her down in the morning and spent 2 hours trying to bring her back. Oral fluids, warmth from the propane lamp, repositioning. She was not finished until she was finished, and by mid-morning she was finished. Ruth moved the body to the south field with the tractor and went back to the barn. 6 kids were lost in the first 48 hours. 2 were stillborn. 3 were too small and too weak, in the range of 2.3 to 2.6 pounds. and did not maintain temperature despite the heat lamp and the tube feeding, and Ruth lost them in the night between the second and third days of their lives, the way small things sometimes go in the night when you have done everything available, and the animal has simply not had enough of a margin built into it before it arrived. The sixth was a kid who made it to 40 hours before his breathing changed and did not change back. 25 kids passed 72 hours. Ruth wrote that number on the wall. 9 of the 25 were being bottle raised, either because their dams were sick or had rejected them, or in 2 cases because the does were milking so poorly after the stress of the winter and the transport that Ruth had made the decision to pull the kids and milk the does into a bucket instead, which would produce more total milk for the farm operation than letting the kids nurse from a dam who had nothing extra to give. She established a bottle schedule on the feed room wall. 6 a.m., 10, 2, 6, 10, with a 2 a.m. check for the smallest animals. She ran this schedule herself. Her mother-in-law, whose name was Miriam and who was 61 and had raised 6 children on this farm before Ruth arrived, took the 6 a.m. and 10 a.m. bottles on the mornings that Ruth had been up past midnight. Miriam did not say anything about the 23 goats. She made coffee and warmed the bottles and went out to the barn when it was her turn. She had her own opinions, which she kept mostly to herself. Occasionally, she said that it was a lot of animals. Ruth agreed that it was a lot of animals. The subject would close there. The foot baths continued every 4 days. By the 3rd bath, 12 of the 16 affected does were walking normally. The remaining 4 were improved, but still showing the careful gait. By the 4th bath, 2 more had resolved. Ruth was watching the last 2 closely. One was responding slowly. The other, a heavy-bodied older doe who might have had the infection longer than the rest, was not responding well to the foot bath alone. Ruth drove to the farm supply at Farmerstown, a 20-minute drive in the buggy, and bought a small bottle of LA 200, which is a long-acting oxytetracycline antibiotic used in goats and other livestock for bacterial infections, including foot rot that has progressed into the deeper tissue. She gave the doe a 4.5 milliliter dose subcutaneously and marked the date on the treatment board. She would watch her for 10 days. The produce auction ran every other Thursday. On the Thursday at the end of the 2nd week of the kidding window, Ruth sold 6 bars of soap and 2 gallons of goat milk lotion and bought a 50-pound bag of milk replacer for the bottle babies. Levi Mast was at the loading dock when she came through with her cart. He was talking to Jonas Byler and another man Ruth did not know well, someone from a district further north. Levi said, with the careful neutrality of a man who does not want to be wrong but is not sure he is right, that he had heard the Coshocton goats were having a rough go of it. Ruth stopped the cart. She said 12 kids had been born alive in the past week, which brought the running total to 25 surviving past 72 hours, from 31 born, from 17 confirmed pregnant does, from 23 purchased. Levi said nothing for a moment. He said that was more than he would have expected from that condition of animal. Ruth said she thought so too, and moved her cart through the dock. Jonas Byler, who had no stake in the question, watched her go and then looked back at Levi. Levi was looking at the far wall of the loading dock, not at anything in particular. He picked up his own crate and went to find his buggy. The quilting frolic at the Raber farm happened on a Friday, 2 weeks after the auction where Ruth had bought the lot. She went for 3 hours in the afternoon because Miriam had the bottles covered and because it was the kind of gathering where not coming was noticed, and she did not want to be noticed for not coming. There were 11 women at the frolic. They were finishing a double wedding ring pattern in blue and cream that was going to a granddaughter of Martha Raber, who was marrying in June. Ruth was not a fast quilter, but she was a careful one, and she took the section near the center where the points had to meet precisely. Sadie Troyer was there. and she mentioned at a point in the afternoon when the general conversation had settled into the comfortable territory of farm news that she had heard Ruth Yoder's goats had not done as well as one might hope, that she had heard it was only 8 or 9 kids surviving out of the whole lot. Ruth looked up from her section of the quilt. She said 22 kids at 8 weeks, which was where she expected to end up by the following week. She said this in the same tone she would have used to give a feed measurement. She went back to the quilt. The room was quiet for a moment in the way that a room is quiet when information has arrived that requires adjustment. One of the Raber daughters, a young woman of about 22 who had been listening with the expression of someone taking a kind of private inventory, looked from Sadie to Ruth and then back to her section of the quilt. Sadie said, well, that was better than she had heard. Ruth agreed that it was. The conversation moved on to the June wedding and the weather and the price of hay, which had been difficult this past year, as it was almost every year now. At 8 weeks, Ruth's count was exactly what she had told the frolic it would be: 22 kids. She checked each one individually that week, weighed them, checked their condition scores, ran her hands along their backs to feel the coverage over the spine and the ribs. The smallest animals were behind where she wanted them, but heading in the right direction. The bottle babies were the strongest of the group, as bottle-raised goats often are, because they had received consistent, measured nutrition from the beginning, rather than competing with siblings at a dam who might have had uneven days. She had lost 3 more kids between the 72-hour checkpoint and 8 weeks. 2 had died of enterotoxemia, a clostridial infection that kills kids quickly, usually between 2 and 8 weeks of age, and that Ruth had encountered before and knew to watch for. The first case had been too fast. The second she had caught early and treated, but it had not been enough. The third loss had been mechanical. A kid who had gotten through a gap in the fence panel and had not been found in time. 22 kids. The foot rot situation had resolved for 14 of the 16 originally affected does. The 15th, the older doe who had received the LA 200, was walking better but still showing some heat in her front right foot when Ruth palpated it, which meant the infection had penetrated deeper than the surface and was likely in the joint. The 16th was similar. Ruth had made the decision about these 2 does in the same way she made all her decisions, which was to wait until she had done everything available and then look at the result plainly. She had done everything available. The result was 2 does with chronic lameness that was not going to fully resolve, and that would get worse with time, and that would cost more in feed and care than they would return in milk or kids. She loaded them onto a trailer on a Tuesday morning quietly and took them to be processed. She did not spend time on it. She noted the date on the treatment board, crossed out the 2 entries, and went back to the barn. 20 does, 22 kids. Net from $94.30 in purchase price, plus feed and medicine and 11 weeks of labor that had cost her sleep and mornings, and 1 set of good barn boots that had finally given up in the foot bath. The number was real. She had not started with it. She had arrived at it by doing the next available thing over and over. From the moment she felt a vibration through the sole of her boot at the bottom rail of a cull pen at the Kidron Auction, and stopped. 22 kids and 20 does. We are going to pause there for a moment because that number took 11 weeks and a great deal of the kind of work that does not look like anything from the road. A person driving past Ruth Yoder's farm on a Thursday morning in late May would have seen a tidy barn, a pasture with some goats in it, a woman in a dark dress and apron moving between the barn and the house. They would not have seen the feed room wall with its pencil columns, or the cot in the tack room, or the rubber trough by the barn door that smelled of zinc sulfate, or the 3 kids Ruth had buried at the south edge of the property, or the 2 lines she had crossed off the treatment board on a Tuesday morning without ceremony. The number 22 was not visible from the road. It had been made in the dark, in increments over 11 weeks, and it was real. Now it was June, and the kidding was done, and Ruth had a different kind of work to do. The pasture situation had been on her mind since March. She was running 20 does plus 22 kids on 63 acres, which was manageable. But the dry lot behind the barn was showing the kind of compaction and standing water that comes from too many hooves on too small a ground during a wet spring. Goats do not tolerate wet conditions well. Wet hooves invite the same problems she had just spent 11 weeks treating. She needed to move animals through the back pasture more efficiently, which meant extending the rotational grazing into the northeast corner, which she had been avoiding because of the low spots. She had been thinking about Eli's comment for 2 years. The dark patch in the northeast corner, the kind of wet that comes from below. She had not acted on it because acting on it required time she had not had, and because a seep that showed itself once in an unusually wet spring might be nothing, a seasonal high water table, a one-time event. But the dry lot was compacting, and she needed the northeast corner, and the only way to know what was in that corner was to go and look at it. She started the drainage swale in the second week of June. The work was straightforward in its design, a shallow channel following the natural grade of the land from the low spot toward the south fence line to move standing water away from the area she wanted to use for grazing. She used a spade and a pick and the small utility cart behind the farm mule, whose name was Pete, and who was 12 years old and had strong opinions about stopping and moderate opinions about starting. The soil in the northeast corner was clay-heavy and resistant in the top 6 inches, then softer below, the kind of softness that held moisture rather than draining it. On the 4th day of digging, at approximately 40 feet of completed channel, Ruth's spade hit a change in the soil that she recognized before she could have explained why. The resistance dropped. The color shifted from the gray-brown of the surrounding clay to something darker, almost black, and when she drove the spade in again and pulled it back, the wall of the channel held a faint wet sheen that was not from the morning's dew. She put her hand against the channel wall and waited. Water appeared at her palm, not a rush, not a dramatic upwelling, a slow, cold darkening of the soil that gathered at the lowest point and began very slowly to collect. She knelt and put both hands in the channel and waited another 2 minutes. The water was cold in the specific way that groundwater is cold, the cold that comes from depth and rock rather than from air temperature. It was a clear morning in June, and the air was already warm, and the water pooling at the bottom of the channel was cold enough that she could feel the difference against her wrists. She stood up and looked at the northeast corner of the pasture, at the limestone ridge along the back fence, at the ground between where she was standing and the barn. The barn floor was 4 feet lower than this corner at its highest point. She had not measured it precisely, but she knew the grade of her own land, and she walked it now, heel to toe, thinking about gravity and distance and whether a passive feed was possible. The distance from the seep to the barn was somewhere between 150 and 200 feet. She would measure it properly before she ordered anything, but the grade was there. She measured it that afternoon with a length of surveyor's string she borrowed from her neighbor to the west, running it from the seep location to the barn wall, staking it at intervals. The total distance was 182 feet. The elevation drop was 4.2 feet over that run, which gave her a grade of approximately 2.3%. That was enough. A gravity feed system required a minimum grade of about 1% to move water reliably through a half-inch pipe. She had more than twice that. She checked the flow rate the next morning with a 5-gallon bucket and her watch. The seep filled the bucket in 3 minutes and 40 seconds. That was roughly 1.3 gallons per minute, or about 78 gallons per hour, or close to 1,800 gallons per day if the flow held constant. Her herd of 42 animals, 20 does and 22 kids growing toward weaning weight, needed somewhere between 150 and 200 gallons per day in warm weather, more if the does were in peak lactation. A reliable 800 gallon per day flow was not just adequate, it was more than she had ever had from any source on this farm. She measured the flow again 2 days later and got 1.28 gallons per minute. The variation was small enough that she trusted it. She needed black polyethylene pipe, half-inch diameter, 200 feet to have a margin, plus fittings and a float valve for the stock tank in the barn. She did not need a pump. She did not need electricity. She needed pipe and gravity and the spring that had been in the northeast corner of her property since before either she or Eli had ever walked on it. She drove the buggy to the harness shop on Township Road 310 on a Thursday morning because Daniel Schlebach carried basic farm supply items in the back of his shop, the kind of small hardware that people needed between proper farm supply runs. He was a young man, 29, who had taken over the shop from his uncle 4 years ago and had expanded it sensibly, adding a small supply shelf for things his customers asked for more than once. Levi Mast was in the shop when Ruth arrived. He was having a trace repaired, a cracked keeper on a driving harness, and he was leaning against the counter while Daniel worked, talking about hay prices and the upcoming school auction. Ruth told Daniel she needed 200 feet of half-inch polypipe, 2 end fittings, and a half-inch float valve rated for a livestock tank. She gave him the list she had written out the night before, specific about each item. Daniel wrote it down and said he had most of it, that he would need to order the float valve but could have it in 2 days. Levi said, without quite directing the comment at Ruth, that he had heard she was putting in a water line. Ruth said she had found a spring in the northeast corner and was piping it to the barn by gravity. Levi said he had driven that corner in the past, that he had not seen any sign of water there. Ruth said it was 40 feet into the swale channel, below the clay layer, and that it was running at a steady 1.3 gallons per minute, as of 3 days ago. Levi was quiet. He turned the broken trace in his hands. He said that the Yoder ground had always run dry on that end, as far back as he could recall, and that Eli's father had drilled a well on the south side of the barn because the northeast didn't hold. Ruth said she understood that, and that the spring was there regardless. Daniel looked up from his riding. He said plainly that a gravity-feed spring at that flow rate would run the whole barn without a pump. Ruth said that was correct. Levi set the trace down on the counter. He did not say anything else about it. He asked Daniel what the repair would cost and paid for it and picked up the harness and left. At the door, he paused, not quite turning back, and said to no one in particular that it was a good corner of ground if the water held. Ruth said she expected it would. The float valve arrived on Saturday. Ruth began laying pipe on Monday morning. The work was uncomplicated in its logic and physical in its requirements. She started at the spring end, where she had already built a simple collection box from pressure-treated lumber, a small lined basin that gathered the seep water and provided a clean entry point for the pipe. The box was 8 inches deep and 12 inches square, which was more than adequate to keep the pipe inlet submerged at the current flow rate. She set the pipe into the collection box, ran it along the ground, and began trenching. She had borrowed a trenching spade from her neighbor, a narrow-bladed tool made for this exact work, and she opened a 6-inch deep channel from the collection box toward the barn in a straight line, adjusting around the fence post at the midpoint and the slight rise in the ground at the 80-foot mark. It took her most of 2 days. The pipe ran in sections joined with barbed fittings and stainless clamps, each joint made tight before she moved on, because a joint she couldn't see after burial was a joint she needed to trust. She buried each section as she went, tamping the soil back over the pipe with the back of the spade, and then standing on it to seat it properly. At 182 feet, she brought the pipe through the barn wall at ground level, ran it up the wall to the stock tank she had positioned in the corner near the feed room door, and connected the float valve. She went back to the collection box and set a clean piece of slate over the top to keep debris and animals out, weighted it with a flat limestone piece she found along the fence line. Then she walked back to the barn and stood in front of the stock tank and waited. The float valve was open because the tank was empty. She had set it that way deliberately. She watched the inlet pipe where it entered the tank, a half-inch black poly pipe end, and she waited for what the grade and the distance and the measurements said should happen. Water came. Not with force, not with drama. A steady flow that caught the light once as it curved over the pipe end and fell into the empty tank, and then was just water going where water goes when the path is clear. Ruth put her hand under the stream. Cold. The same cold from the channel wall, the same cold from 40 feet down in the clay, the same water that had been moving through the limestone shelf under the northeast corner of this property for longer than any living person could account for. She stood there until the tank was a quarter full, which took about 12 minutes at the flow rate she had measured, and then she went inside. Eli had mentioned the dark patch once. He'd been standing at the fence line after a wet March, looking at the northeast corner, and he had said mostly to himself that he thought there might be water under that ground, that his father had always said the limestone ran deep on that end. He had not said it with conviction or urgency. It was the kind of thing a person notices and stores. Ruth had stored it in the same place. She thought about that now, not with sentiment, but in the plain way she thought about most things, as information that had taken a long time to become useful. She had not known how to find the spring when Eli was alive. She had not known she would need to find it in the way she needed to find it now. She had not thought about it during the 2 nights she sat with Eli in the hospital, had not thought about the farm at all during those 2 nights in any productive way, had only thought about the next thing to check, and whether there was still a next thing to check. There had not been, in the end. She had checked everything available. She had not finished until she was finished. That was the discipline. And it was not the same as hope, and it was not the same as denial. It was simply the refusal to call something concluded before the evidence required it. Eli had been finished when he was finished, not before. And the spring had been there the whole time, under the clay, under the northeast corner, real and patient and waiting for someone to dig far enough to find it. She did not say any of this out loud. There was no one in the barn with her. By August, the herd had settled into its rhythm. The 22 kids had been sorted at 12 weeks. Ruth had walked through them 3 times over the course of a week, looking at conformation, utter attachment on the doolings, the structural qualities she wanted to carry forward in a dairy herd. She kept 11 doolings, the ones with the best structural foundations and the clearest dairy character. The other 11, 10 wethers and 1 dooling with an asymmetrical jaw she did not want in her breeding stock, went to the Kidron Auction on a Thursday in July. They sold at $38 per head, average, which was a fair price for mixed-breed wethers and a cull dooling of the size and condition she was bringing. That was $408 in gross returns from 1 lot of 11 animals. Ruth noted the number on the feed room wall below the other numbers. $94.30 paid, $418 returned from the first partial cull, 16 does now in milk production, 11 doelings in the grow-out pen building toward first freshening in approximately 7 months. She also noted below those numbers the feed and medicine costs she had tracked since March: milk replacer, zinc sulfate concentrate, LA 200, the polypipe and fittings and float valve, a new rubber trough for the footbath because the first one had cracked. The total came to $312.40. Net from the first coal sale was $105.60, which was not the point of the exercise but was not nothing. The milk from the 16 producing does was the point, and the 11 duelings entering production the following spring were the longer point, and the spring feeding the barn without a pump or a well or a monthly water bill was the point beneath all the other points. The herd was real. It was built. It was not the herd she had started with, which had been $94.30, and a cull pen and a laboring doe pressing her forehead against a rail. It was the thing that came after all the steps between there and here. Daniel Schlabach mentioned Ruth's name to Carol Prentice in late August. Carol Prentice ran a small artisan creamery in Worcester, 40 minutes north of Ruth's farm, that produced fresh chèvre and aged chevron milk products for farmers' markets and 4 restaurant accounts in the region. She had been buying raw goat milk from a farm near Millersburg for 3 years, and that farm, the Brenneman operation, was retiring, the older generation moving to a smaller place in Indiana, the son not interested in the dairy side. Carol had been asking around for 2 months about who in Holmes and Wayne counties was running a clean goat dairy with reliable volume. Daniel had mentioned it to Carol's husband at the harness shop, not as a formal referral, just as the kind of practical information that moves through a rural supply chain the way useful things do. Someone has something. Someone else needs it. A third person knows both of them. Carol drove out on a Thursday morning in September without calling ahead, because she did not have a way to call ahead to a farm without a landline, and she had gotten the address from the auction manager at Kidron, who knew Ruth's farm by its county road number. Ruth was in the barn when the car pulled up, running the does through their morning milking on the stanchion line 2 at a time. She heard the car and came to the barn door and saw a woman in her late 40s in practical clothing, not a tourist expression on her face, not the tentative look of someone who has not been around livestock. She was looking at the barn with a working person's eyes. Ruth told her she would be finished in 40 minutes and that she was welcome to wait. Carol said she would rather watch if that was all right. Ruth said that was fine and went back to the milking. Carol stood at the barn door for a few minutes and then came inside and stood against the wall and watched. She did not say much. She looked at the does, their condition scores, the way they moved onto the stanchion. She looked at the cleanliness of the milk line and the collection setup, the propane hot water Ruth used for equipment sanitation, the storage can. She asked what breeds were represented in the herd, and Ruth told her, mostly Boer cross with some La Mancha and Nubian influence, which gave heavier milk with a butterfat content that ran consistently above 4%, which she knew because she had been testing it monthly with a local extension contact. Carol asked how long the herd had been in production. Ruth said this particular group since spring, though she had been running a dairy herd on this farm for 6 years. Carol asked about the volume. Ruth told her 16 dozen milk, averaging about 1.5 quarts per milking, twice daily, which was roughly 3 quarts per doe per day, which was 48 quarts or 12 gallons per day from the current milking string. She told her the 11 dolings would be freshening in the spring, which would bring the milking string to potentially 27 does if all went well, which would bring daily production to somewhere between 18 and 22 gallons, depending on individual output. Carol asked about the water source. Ruth told her about the spring. Carol walked the barn for another 10 minutes, looked at the dry lot, looked at the northeast pasture, stood at the stock tank for a moment and listened to the float valve, which made a faint sound when it opened to let water in, a small mechanical click. Then she made an offer. She said she wanted a standing weekly contract for Ruth's full milk production at 30 $30 per hundredweight, pick up at the farm every Thursday, starting as soon as Ruth was ready. She said the price was above the current regional average for raw goat milk, which was running between $32 and $35 per hundredweight because she needed reliability and she was paying for it. Ruth asked if the contract could be adjusted when the Dowlings freshened in the spring and the volume increased. Carol said it could, and that she would prefer it. Ruth said she would need 3 days to think about it. Carol gave her a business card, which Ruth took and looked at and put in her apron pocket, and they shook hands, and Carol drove back toward Worcester. Ruth went back to the barn and finished her work, and that night, after the children were in bed and Miriam had gone home to her own house next door, she sat at the kitchen table with the business card and the feed room wall numbers she had written on a sheet of paper, and she worked out what the contract would mean over 12 months, then over 24. She worked it out twice to make sure the arithmetic was right. She folded the paper and put it under the salt cellar on the table, where she kept things she was still thinking about, and went to bed. She called Carol Prentice from the phone shanty at the end of the lane on Saturday morning and said she would take the contract. The Kidron Auction the following Thursday was the last Thursday of September. Ruth went to sell soap, as she did every other week, and to pick up a bag of mineral supplement from the supply section. Sadie Troyer was there with preserves and a quilt top she was selling on consignment. She was talking to a woman Ruth did not know, an Englisher in her 50s with a canvas market bag, who was looking at Sadie's table and asking questions about local farms. Sadie, with the authority of a person whose information was occasionally in the right neighborhood, told the woman that Ruth Yoder was the one to talk to about goat products, gesturing at Ruth across the aisle. She said Ruth was the one with 200 goats, and her voice carried the satisfied note of someone providing a definitive fact. Ruth set down the mineral bag and looked at Sadie. The Englisher turned and looked at Ruth with interest. Ruth said, 22 Dowlings and 20 does. So far. The woman laughed, a real laugh, not polite. She asked Ruth about the soap and then about the milk. And then Ruth mentioned the contract with the Worcester Creamery, which she had not mentioned to anyone yet. And the woman said she had actually heard of the creamery, had bought a chèvre from them at a Columbus farmer's market. Sadie was quiet through this conversation. She rearranged her preserves jars once and then again. She was not a person who liked being corrected, but she was a person who could recognize, in the moment after correction, when the correction was fair. When the Englisher moved on, Sadie said in a voice that had something different in it than her usual tone, that it sounded like things had come out well. Ruth said she thought they would be better in the spring when the Dowlings freshened. Sadie said that was good. She said Eli would have been pleased. Ruth looked at her for a moment. She said she thought he would. Then she picked up the mineral bag and went to find her buggy. On a Friday evening in October, after the milking was done and the kids, which were not kids any longer but proper youngdas with opinions and a clear sense of hierarchy, had been settled in the grow-out pen for the night, Ruth walked the northeast pasture. She did it most evenings now, a check of the fencing and the water, the kind of routine observation that she had learned to trust over years of keeping animals. The light was low and orange and coming through the oaks along the north fence line, and the air had the first real cold of autumn in it, a clean, still cold. She stopped at the new fence section that enclosed the spring area, where she had run a line of woven wire to keep the goats out of the collection box and the immediate ground around it. The stock tank on the other side of the post, the one she had connected to the spring pipe, sat full and quiet. She had put a small trough in the northeast pasture itself, gravity-fed from a T-fitting midway along the main line, so the animals could drink out there rather than walking to the barn for every drink. That trough was full, too. She rested her hand on the fence post, felt through the post, The faint vibration of the float valve in the barn stock tank, 182 feet away, opening and closing as the water level moved, doing its small mechanical work. It was not the same as the vibration at the cull pen rail, not exactly, but it was the same kind of thing. A physical fact that arrived through the body before it arrived through the mind, telling her something was working. The water ran through the pipe and into the tank, and the float valve opened and the tank filled and the float valve closed over and over, without her help, without electricity, without a bill at the end of the month. The spring had been there under the clay since before she or Eli's father had walked this ground. It did not know it had been found. It did not know anything. It simply ran steadily at 1.3 gallons per minute, because that is what it did. Ruth checked the collection box. The slate cover was in place, the limestone weight seated. The pipe inlet was clear. Everything was working as it should. She checked it because she always checked before she concluded. She found it good and went inside. There is a difference between an assessment and a conclusion. An assessment is what you make when you have looked at what is present and have done what can be done. A conclusion is what you make when you have decided the thing is finished. Ruth Yoder understood the difference better than most people understand it, because she had learned it at a cost that did not need to be spoken aloud. She applied it to goats. She applied it to land. She applied it once in a hospital in a hard February, in a way that did not change the outcome but was still right, because it is always right to withhold the conclusion until the evidence requires it. The evidence required it eventually. It always does. What she built from 23 cull goats and a $94.30 auction receipt and a spring that had been waiting under 40 feet of clay was not remarkable in the way that visible things are remarkable. Nobody photographed it. The community adjusted its understanding of what she was doing, quietly, across a handful of conversations at loading docks and harness shops and quilting tables, without ceremony. Carol Prentice drove out from Worcester and looked at the animals and made an offer based on what she saw. The spring ran at 1.3 gallons per minute regardless of who believed in it. This is what patient, procedural work looks like from the outside. It looks like a woman in a barn who has not slept. It looks like pencil numbers on a feed room wall. It looks like nothing from the road. And then the numbers are real, and the spring is real, and the contract is signed, and it has always been there, under everything, waiting for someone willing to keep digging. If this story found you at the right moment, share it with someone who's been told what they have isn't worth the trouble. Drop your city in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. And if you've ever checked something everyone else had already written off, I want to hear what you found.